Great Ideas is a program devoted to uncovering the meaning of the ideas we all use every day of our lives. In the period to follow, Dr. Mortimer J. Adler will undertake to discuss some aspect of a basic idea. Dr. Adler.
Mr. Luckman and I welcome you to another discussion of the great ideas. Today, we begin the discussion of the idea of learning, and we shall continue it during the 4 sessions to follow. Mr. Luckman is here to ask questions of the sort that may arise in your mind as we proceed with this discussion.
And may I ask a question right away?
So soon, Lloyd?
Yes. You see, during the last week, I've been thinking about the subject you've chosen for this series of discussions of the great ideas, and I've been wondering why you've chosen the idea of learning as against the idea of education. Are they the same in your mind, learning and education? Shall we be dealing then with the same problems and the same ideas under the head of learning as we would if you were discussing education?
I think answering that question is a very good way to begin. Mr. Luckman asks a question that you may be asking yourself. Are the ideas of education and learning really the same idea with 2 names? Are the problems of education the same as the problems of learning? No, I think they are not. Education is a much larger, much more comprehensive subject than learning is. The problems of learning, I think, are only one small segment in that larger field of problems which we call education. If I had some books here, as I think I have, on education, I think I can show you precisely what I mean. Yes, I have here, too, basic texts on the philosophy of education and on problems of education. And if you were to take one of these books and look through it, or as a matter of fact, just look at the table of contents, this is what you'd find. It would deal with the problems of the organization of the school system, the problems of the state control of education, or the role of politics in education, the problem of who shall be educated in the schools and how long they shall be educated there, whether all should be given the same kind of schooling, the problem of different kinds of education, the relation of liberal and vocational education, or religious and intellectual education. And finally, among all these problems, we would come, I think, finally to the problem of the content and methods of education, what should be taught and how it should be taught. And it is only here that we would begin to touch on the problems of learning. Now, that I think shows that the problems of learning are only part of the problems of education. To my mind, the most interesting part. The rest deals with externals. Learning is the very heart of education. Now, learning itself is a large subject. Just consider for a moment what learning covers. Learning represents every aspect of acquired modifications of human behavior. Learned behavior is modified behavior. The process of learning is the process by which we acquire all the modifications of our emotional, our moral, or our intellectual behavior.
Well, then,
John Dewey, John Dewey, I think, has said this more expertly than anybody else when he says that learning, the process of learning, is identical with the process of growth, leaving out, of course, the physical growth of the body. In his view of learning, the extent to which a man has learned something learned in the course of his lifetime is measured by the amount of emotional, intellectual, moral, and spiritual growth he has acquired.
Well, just as you were touching on that very definition, it seems to me then that the problems of learning are the problems of educational psychology. Now, if that's so, is it that you're going to deal with these problems in the same way as you would with the psychological aspect of this whole idea of learning? Are you going to discuss the various theories, the Gestalt theory, the conditioned reflex theory, the trial and error? And
No, not quite that way, Mr. Luckman. I think that would take us too far afield. Mr. Luckman has just referred to the controversy among experimental psychologists about what learning is. And there are, as he indicates, 4 or 5 major conflicting theories based on researches in the experimental laboratory on the behavior of animals and sometimes human beings. So I must say, most of this experimental work is based on animal behavior. Now, again, let me see if I have a book here that will help us get this more concrete. If one were to take up any ordinary textbook of psychology and turn in it to the chapter on learning, one would find that it dealt with the following kinds of things. It would deal with how rats learn to run through mazes by trial and error. Or it would deal with how cats, again by trial and error, learn to solve the problem of getting out of boxes into which they are locked. Or, as in another case, it might, the chapter might deal with the conditioned reflex, with the conditioning of the behavior of a dog, as in the case of Pavlov's dog, whose salivary reflex was conditioned in the laboratory. Or, finally, it might, as you mentioned, the Gestalt experiments, it might deal with how chicks or apes learn by perceptual insight. Now, there is no question that some human learning is on the level of this kind of animal behavior which is studied in the laboratory. But certainly, this is not true of all human learning, and certainly it is not true of the most significant aspects of human learning. Let me read you what Professor Hilgard of Stanford University has to say on this subject in what, to my mind, is the authoritative book on it, his book on the theories of learning. Professor Hilgard reaches the conclusion that all these theories of learning to which I have just referred are unsatisfactory because they are too largely based, he says, on the behavior of animals and on the assumption that human learning can be best understood by comparison with that of animals. He says, I quote him here, this comparative approach, studying animals in relation to men and men in relation to animals, neglects the fact that human beings are brighter than animals and are able to use language, and therefore probably learn differently because of these advances over the lower animals. Now, I am going to deal, in this series of discussions, I would like to deal with human learning. Not merely exclusively with human learning, but with what is most characteristic about human learning. With the kind of learning that involves the use of language and of symbols. With the kind of learning that involves ideas, maybe even the great ideas. And with the kind of learning that results in the acquisition of understanding or knowledge or wisdom, not just the acquisition of bodily habits or the solution of practical problems.
Well, now you certainly have narrowed the subject considerably by restricting it to what is characteristically called human learning.
Yes.
Now, do you also intend then to go further in narrowing the subject? From your last remark, I'm asking this question in particular because it seems you're saying you're going to talk only about intellectual learning, the acquisition of knowledge.
Yes, Mr. Luckman, I'm afraid I'm going to narrow the subject even further because human learning, though it's a part of the subject of education, is itself a very large problem. Perhaps I can show you the part of the whole field we are going to deal with by drawing a diagram on the blackboard. Suppose that circle represents the whole field of education, and this small segment of it that I'm drawing there represents that part of the whole field of education which deals with learning. Now, learning is a large subject that involves animal learning and human learning. And human learning is a large subject for it and deals with emotional learning, how we change and cultivate our emotions, with moral learning, how we form our moral character, and with intellectual learning, how we improve and stock our mind. Now, all these subjects are interesting. I don't mean to say that intellectual learning, the improvement of the mind, is more important than moral learning or emotional learning. I simply mean that we can't discuss everything. Perhaps we can discuss the formation of a good character and emotional adjustments at some other time. In this series of discussions, I would like to deal with intellectual learning, with the kind of learning that involves teachers, and the role of teaching in learning. Teaching is not involved in animal learning, and as we understand teaching, as you and I understand teaching, the kind of thing that goes on in classrooms, it is mainly a process that involves the improvement of the mind, not the formation of character or the clarification and readjustment of the emotions. Now this leads at once. Once we see that we're dealing with the kind of learning that involves teaching, this leads at once to a problem that I should like to present to you. It is the problem of the role of the teacher in human learning. And I would like to begin by asking you to think with me of what is perhaps the most fundamental distinction in the whole field of human learning, the distinction between learning with teachers and without teachers, or as it is sometimes called, learning by instruction, that is with teachers, and learning by discovering things for yourself, that is without teachers. Now there are three consequences that follow from the understanding, three things that follow when we understand this distinction between learning by instruction or with teachers and learning by discovery or without teachers. The first is that nothing which can be learned by instruction cannot also be learned by discovery. Or to put it positively, everything we can be instructed in, someone else must have learned by discovery. Discovery must ultimately, in the history of the race, precede instruction. For if this teacher who teaches something learned what he teaches from someone else who learned it from another teacher, that cannot go back indefinitely. Somewhere in the knowledge that we pass on in the process of teaching, someone must have discovered it for himself. So we see, first of all, that learning by discovery is primary. Learning by instruction is secondary. And if this is so, then we also see that teachers are, in an absolute sense, dispensable. Not indispensable, but dispensable. For nothing which can be learned by instruction with teachers is impossible to learn without teachers. Now, I don't mean that teachers aren't useful. They are. And I don't mean that for most of us, teachers aren't necessary. They are. For most of us, would not be able to learn without the help of teachers, or learn as rapidly, or learn as easily the things we have to come to know in the course of our lifetime. But I do mean that teachers are only helps. And this understanding of the teacher as an aid, as something which helps in the process of learning, is the deepest insight into the nature of teaching in relation to learning. Perhaps another way of seeing this is to consider the way in which the teacher is like the farmer or the physician. The farmer doesn't produce the grains of the field. He merely helps them grow. The teacher, the physician, does not produce the health of the body. He merely helps the body maintain its health or regain its health. And so the teacher does not produce knowledge in the mind. He merely helps the mind discover it for itself. Socrates, who was the greatest of teachers and really the model for all teachers, epitomized this point about the art of teaching when he compared himself as a teacher to a midwife. He said, all I do is assist in the birth of knowledge, the birth of understanding of ideas in someone else's mind. And by helping them in the labor of discovering, I make the process of discovery easier for them and less painful. Now this indicates, I think, another fundamental fact about teaching and learning. Learning by instruction, learning with the help of teachers is no less active than learning by discovery. To suppose it is, to suppose that when we are taught we are passive, is to make the most grievous error one can make about both learning and teaching. In fact, one ought to say, I think, that if you understood Socrates' conception of teaching, it is the learner who is going through the process of labor to give birth to knowledge or understanding himself. The teacher, like the midwife, is merely standing by, is merely assisting. And when we understand this, we ought to, I think, re-examine that very distinction we began with, namely the distinction between learning by instruction and learning by discovery, because discovery, the labor of discovery, the labor of thinking for oneself, is involved in all learning. Perhaps it would be better to say then, instead of saying learning by instruction and learning by discovery, call them both learning by discovery, and call the learning with the teacher aided discovery, and the learning without a teacher unaided discovery. Let me show you this in a chart. We started out with the distinction between learning by discovery without the help of teachers and learning by instruction with the help of teachers. And we saw that since both involve activity on the part of the learner, both are really learning by discovery, and the distinction is better made by calling the learning we do without the help of teachers unaided discovery, and the learning we do with the help of teachers aided discovery. And that means that in both forms of learning, it is the learner who must be active. It is the learner who must work or labor. The fact that the learner may be helped by the teacher doesn't permit him to sit back passively and absorb knowledge like a sponge or like a blotto. In other words, all learning, with as well as without teachers, is fundamentally learning by discovery, an active process, a process of learning from experience, of learning by doing, not by having something done to oneself. That is why it is so wrong to say, I'll learn you, instead of I'll teach you. For even when I am teaching you, it is you who have to do the learning by yourself.
Dr. Adler, did I really hear correctly? Did I hear you say that all learning is learning by doing and must involve experience?
That's what I said.
Well, then I wonder if this means that you accept that view of human learning that has become the platform, actually, of progressive education, at least in the United States, for the last 50 years.
Well, I can see why you could hardly believe your ears. I have the reputation, I'm afraid, of being an opponent of progressive education. But I'm only opposed to what is wrong with progressive education, not to what is right about it. Let me explain. Let me see if I can explain this distinction. Let's take the sentence, or the statement that is, as Mr. Luckman says, the platform of progressive education. All learning is by doing. Now, what is wrong with that statement is a certain interpretation that is put upon it. If the word doing is very narrowly interpreted to mean only practical activity, certain forms of social action, certain forms of artistic production, then I think the statement is not true, for it excludes such activities as reading or listening to a lecture or, most important of all, thinking. And if the progressive educator says to me that he doesn't mean to exclude thinking, but only thinking as divorced from practical projects or problems, then I say his conception of the project method is as narrow as his conception of doing. Now, what is right or sound about the statement that all learning is by doing is contained in the insight that all learning involves activity. It cannot be a passive process. It can't be like the habits formed in matter, something that they receive when something is done to them. May I have a piece of paper there, Lloyd, please? You take a piece of paper, and I actively crease it. And the paper, as you can see, then retains the crease. It retains the crease. But that crease in a piece of paper is not like a human habit. A human habit isn't formed by having something done to you. A human habit is formed by your doing something. And that is the difference. And the more activity there is in learning, the more genuine learning takes place. In the second place, the doing or activity which is involved in learning can never be simply bodily activity. It must involve mental activity and, above all, thinking. For there is no genuine learning that does not involve thinking. Now, if thinking is not doing, then the statement, all learning is by doing, is false, and we ought to say, all learning is by activity, and mainly by the activity of thinking. For without active thinking, all you could possibly have is rote learning. When we use the very words rote learning, we mean it isn't real learning. Now, there's a third point I should like to make, and that is that among the activities that are involved in learning are things that ordinarily aren't classified as doing in the ordinary sense of doing. There are such things as reading or listening, and the point is that they're just as active, those things are just as active as writing or speaking. The progressive educator is right only when he rejects the caricature of these things, the kind of caricature that is expressed in that definition of a lecture as the process whereby the notes of the lecturer become the notes of the student without passing through the minds of either. Now, finally, the project method with which the progressive educator is so concerned is, I think, quite sound if what it is insistent about is that the student have a genuine interest in the problem, that he be engaged in the problem before he comes to understand the answer. Certainly, the motivation, the deepest motivation in learning is to be concerned with the problem and to wish the solution of it. Problems or questions come before answers, and we don't motivate people in learning unless we make them genuinely feel the problem for which the answer is the solution. This we know to be true in the case of animals. They won't learn unless they're motivated by deep biological drives of hunger and sex. And as John Dewey, summarizing this point, says, the problem is the very principle, the point of departure of learning. He says that the problem is the very first principle of learning. Problems that connect with the experience of the learner, problems that are within the range of his capacities, problems that arouse in the learner an active quest for knowledge and for the production of new ideas.
And there you have another basic point in the program of the progressive education, that there can be no learning without interest or motivation. Now, I wonder, do you think that that point of theirs is partly right and partly wrong? Or do you accept...
No, Mr. Luckman. There, I would say there's nothing at all wrong with their point about motivation. There, my only quarrel is that they draw a wrong conclusion from the very truth of the proposition that interest is essential and motivation is essential to learning. Let me see if I can tell you what I mean by answering Mr. Luckman in this way. No educator, no teacher, I think, has ever supposed that learning was possible without motivation or interest. The progressive educators didn't discover this truth. In the 5th century B.C., Plato, in one of the first great works in education, made the point that there should be no hothouse forcing of the child, that interest must be cultivated not only in the child stage of learning, but at all later stages of learning. Now, many progressive educators, I think, have drawn a wrong conclusion from this fundamental truth. That wrong conclusion consists in thinking that we ought to begin with the interests of the child. The child comes to school with certain interests, and we ought to take those interests as dictating to us what the child should learn and what the child should be taught. This is what is meant by the child-centered school, in which the child's interests are the pivots of all learning and teaching. I think this goes against the grain of the normal child. I think the normal child would much rather have new interests aroused in him by teachers than have what he is to study derived entirely from the interests he brings to school. I never forget the story. It told me about a boy in a progressive school, little boy in a progressive school in New York. The teacher found him crying in the hall one day and asked him what he was crying about. He said tearfully, "Teacher, do we have to do what we want to do today?" That seems to me to sum the matter up. Now, the right conclusion to draw from the fundamental truth that all learning must be motivated by interests in the very subjects or problems to be solved, the right conclusion to draw from that puts the burden on the teacher, not on the student. It is up to the teachers and the educators to decide what should be taught And then having decided what the student should learn, their duty, their task, is to arouse a deep and lively interest in the very things that should be learned. For example, I would be a very poor teacher with regard to the great ideas if I merely talked about them, if I merely expounded them, if I didn't do what I could, however poorly I may do it, to arouse your interest in them, to see if I can motivate you to be interested in them for the sake of the understanding that can be derived from considering the ideas and the problems that they raise. Now, how to do this? How to do this? How to cultivate and interests? How to motivate people in the process of learning is a question we will not have time to discuss today. In fact, it is a very difficult question because so much of it depends on the art of the teacher, and so much depends on the employment of that art in particular situations, in particular classrooms, particular students. But perhaps we shall be able to return to certain aspects of this problem next time when we consider individual differences in learning, when we consider, above all, the difference between children and adults as learners. Now, perhaps I could say a word more about this problem of individual differences in learning.
Please do.
We, in the schools, in adult life, are aware of the fact that human beings differ one from another in their talents, in their temperaments, and their interests. And we too often, I think, draw the conclusion that people should be guided in their learning, and we should be guided in teaching them by what they are interested in, by their talents. Let them follow their talents. Let them develop their talents. Let them only pursue their interests. I think this is the wrong, though it seems like an obvious conclusion, nevertheless like the wrong conclusion. If there are certain things fundamental to human life, if there is a body of wisdom, which all men should have, if there are certain kinds of knowledge, certain arts that all men should have, then this should be in the possession of all men, regardless of their individual differences, regardless of what their talents are or their interests. In fact, I would almost say that in the schools particularly, our task is to work against the talents of the child. For the talents of the child indicate where the child has strength, and where the child doesn't have talents is where the child is weak. And the job of teaching that child or educating that child is a job of pushing the learning process on the side of the child's weakness, not on the side of the child's strength. The child that is interested in poetry and says, I'm not interested in mathematics and I can't do mathematics, should be, I think, helped and persuaded to study mathematics, because if it has a talent for poetry, that talent will, I think, can't ever be suppressed and will lead to learning in its own way. Our task, I think, is to find those basic subjects which all men in school and in adult life should learn, and then somehow, by the way in which we teach them, by the way in which we suggest they be learned, overcome the differences between human beings, the differences that arise because they are born with quite different talents and quite different temperamental interests.
Well, I do hope in our succeeding discussions you'll be able to develop this very challenging thought further, Dr. Adler.
Well, I don't know that I'll be able to develop it much further, because next time I would like to deal mainly with the problem of adult learning, the learning of adults, as contrasted with the learning of children in school. I sincerely hope that all of you realize that no human being is ever too old to learn. And if you agree with me that none of us is ever too old to learn, that we are never too old to learn, then I feel sure that you will be interested in the problem we shall deal with next time, namely adult learning, the learning of adults, which is quite different in its problems and its nature from the learning of children. I hope you'll be with us next time as we discuss this very interesting subject. Thank you very much.